Do you guys hear when that lady says that, or just me?
Yeah.
Yeah, I do.
I always wonder. All right, we are talking about gut health again. We are back. We're going to do gut health 2.0 because we didn't get it all in. This is part of a series of 3 reasons I am not losing weight that have nothing to do with diet and exercise. Everybody loves to blame something else, so we're going to give them some things that they can talk about. Right? Everybody likes it's got to be my hormones, right? It's got to be my gut, right? Um, so last time we talked about a lot of what were some of the things we talked about last time in gut health 1.0? We talked about a lot. How to know
Probiotics,
probiotic, how
gut
to even
diversity.
identify if I'm having gut health.
Yeah.
I love talking about the gut to skin, the gut to brain axis.
All the axes.
I
Yeah.
think that's really cool. I've had a couple conversations with people this week around what we were talking about as far as the gut and the skin, the gut and mental health. Um, uh, sunlight. I have somebody's looking at being a client who says she completely 100% avoids the sun because she doesn't want to have wrinkles. She's 42.
Yeah, because that's what all estheticians will tell you. So we got to beef with estheticians too.
Oh man, yeah, for sure. I know people that work in skincare said completely 100% avoid the sun. It's bad for your skin all the way around.
It's bad for your skin, but it's also, or let's say it is bad for your skin, but then good luck with, poor mitochondrial function and lowered immune function and so on and so forth. So it's like, do you want a perfect face and terrible everything else?
Yeah,
Or
yeah.
Also,
Well, I
the
think it's like where when Mike always says like too much of anything is always a bad thing. So I
is
try to
in the
like
place,
preach
right?
that. Like you don't have to sit in the sun for 50 hours, but if you can go
Yeah.
outside for an hour a day, wear a hat,
Yeah.
like
I'm
you'll
not
be
asking you
fine.
to go out and get sunburned every weekend.
Yeah,
Right?
no,
15, 20 minutes of sunlight direct exposure is great, right? And great for
you'll
the
be
gut
fine.
skin.
Right.
So
also, the really interesting thing, just circling back to that, if you look, the frontline intervention right now that's being told to physicians through a platform called Up to Date, which is like the standardized reference source that physicians are utilizing for psoriasis. The number one frontline treatment is phototherapy. It's 5 to 10 minutes of midday sunlight, and they're finding that changes the immune system, turns off this autoimmune side, and actually stimulates resolution of psoriasis. So
calling it phototherapy.
phototherapy, right?
In other
And
words, getting sun.
yeah, and so they're even seeing like even red light therapy that they're utilizing for like hair loss and all these other things now. Where you get that sun rises and sun sets. That's more of the reddish hues. So all of these fancy things that we're now talking about, they've already existed. Nature's been doing these things for a long, long time. But when you avoid that input from nature, don't be surprised when your physiology gets offline.
Me and Gray know somebody, let's just not name it either, who is promoting laying on red light mats. So when they exercise and work out and pre and post, they're doing laying on red light mats. And I kind of thought like, well, like you said, I remember reading about red light therapy when it kind of got popular, when people were sticking red lights in their nose. And it's just funny, right? It is funny.
You know what's so annoying to me
And
though is like
I'm like, go outside in the morning and go outside at night, but they're selling this red light that you're sitting. It's just funny.
what's so annoying to me is like people don't want to spend money on like a gym pass and healthy food and like just stuff that's very basic. And when we tell them like, go outside and take a walk and get in the sun, they're like, what the hell? But then they want to spend money on sticking red lights up their nose and going and sitting on red light mats and just like all this stupid shit. I'm like, can you just spend money on basic stuff and not all this fancy stuff? And then maybe you'd have money to like have a coach that is worth a shit.
Or don't spend money at all and get reconnected with nature that's been there all the
Yeah,
time.
it's so
Dude,
crazy
foot
to me.
grounding, and we'll get back on topic. Foot grounding is something I learned when I was years ago. I started taking judo, and they
Mm-hmm.
talked about foot grounding on the earth to where we were
Yeah.
actually judo mats outside and learning to do grounding exercise. I remember thinking it was so stupid. They would stomp certain parts of their feet on the grass, and now look what we're talking about: foot grounding and feet to
But
earth.
you feel so much better after being outside. Like you get it's like an immediate dopamine hit.
Mm-hmm.
so crazy.
So gut health,
Anyways,
rolling through it, right? Gut health. So we talked about all that on 1.0. Now we're on 2.0. Okay. We really want to hit home on gut health and weight loss, because everybody wants weight loss. Everybody wants muscle building. Everybody wants composition changing. So we're going to go straight to one of the topics, and might kind of pick these out. The role of gut health in nutrient partitioning. So kind of explain what you mean by partitioning, and the role with fat loss, muscle growth, muscle protein synthesis. What is that? Why is it important? What do you mean by partitioning? I imagine you're talking about nutrient uptake, like your ability to absorb nutrients and send it to where it needs to go in the body.
Yep, exactly. And we should probably even take like one step prior to that, because Josh, you and I had a conversation about someone recently who did some stool testing. And so this is getting more popular now with direct to consumer tests. So people say, well, I think I have a gut issue, but I really want to get some data and verify this prior to figuring out things that I can change that improve my sleep and my muscle mass and everything else, my fat loss. So a lot of these direct to consumer tests show up now on the market. So you have things like Viome or Ubiome or Everlywell, a lot of these things that you can even find now. I think Target carries Everlywell tests, so you can just go and buy them. I'll make the blanket statement right here and now. There is no direct to consumer test that is validated that you can actually get good actionable data from, that you actually know what's going on in your gut, because we don't know what's good for this person versus what's good for that person. We have a general idea. Obviously, if you have E. coli, that's a problem. But in terms of the good organisms that should or should not be there, we just don't know enough yet to say this is optimal and this is suboptimal. So if you're doing these tests or you're seeing these tests advertised, they are getting more popular all over social media. Would not recommend you do them. Everybody that I've seen that's done an Everlywell food sensitivity test, they take all those foods out for like 2 months and they feel no differently, and they add them back in and they feel no differently. The test is not sensitive or specific. So it can't tell you a true false positive or a true positive versus a false positive, and it can't tell you a true negative versus a false negative. So
some of them a little bit blanket statement too. We all know that if we ate less processed foods and ate more raw foods, and ate more foods that didn't come in a box and had single source, meaning a potato is a potato and a banana is a banana. Do you think some of those are just a little bit generic? Because everybody should probably eat less food out of a box, less processed foods, right?
Yeah, the recommendations definitely are generic. But I mean, even like the other thing people have to realize is these companies will pop up. Like when I did my first master's, we would have companies come to us and say, hey, validate our stuff now that it's already on the market. And I was like, excuse me, what? No, I'm not going to prove that your product works when you're already selling it to people. So 2 of these labs actually had major issues. There was one called, I think it was Thanos, and they were trying to basically do a blood spot. So you basically prick your finger, take 1 drop of blood, and they were going to measure all your hormones and everything from a single drop of blood. So you could do it from home. Well, it turns out that there was this massive lawsuit. The lab was committing international fraud. The CEO was indicted. She went.
Yes, that was a show. It was so good.
Yes.
Yeah. So that's the first thing people need to realize, is that these labs pop up, and there's sometimes like supplement companies. They're kind of fly by night. They're here and then they're gone. The other thing too is one of the labs that was having stool testing for people, they were drawing their standardized reference ranges for what should be normal in a human. They were drawing those from animal fecal matter, from dog poop. So they were literally analyzing dog poop and saying, oh, here's the organisms that should or should not be present within here. So now we're going to take your sample and compare it to that. Human physiology and dog physiology is drastically different. When you look at the mouth of a human, there's tons of organisms in there, some good, some bad. When you look at the mouth of a dog, it's totally different. They have way higher types of organisms, because they can literally eat fecal matter and not get sick, versus human. Totally different. So just keep that in mind, that these organisms maybe should be there in some people, maybe should not in others, but there's no kind of standardized, you should not see this in this person and you should see this in this person. So that being said, there's no direct consumer testing available. And you might say, okay, well, I'm just going to go to my doctor and get it. Your doctor is going to look for isolated organisms. So do you have E. coli? Do you have salmonella? Do you have C. diff? Do you have H. pylori? If you don't have all these big heavy hitters, he's going to say, you're not diseased. So I'm not sure why you're feeling this way with your GI tract. So there are a couple other stool tests that are available that are fairly valid. The one is through a company called Genova Diagnostics. It's called a GI Effects. And so that would be a very good one to look into currently. But again, you can't just go out and purchase that yourself. You have to be working with a physician or a provider who utilizes that. So now kind of circling back around, what was the first thing you had mentioned?
Nutrient partitioning. Okay.
Right. So nutrient partitioning. So this is just the idea that you eat, let's say you eat a slice of pizza, and everybody's assuming that just immediately goes straight to your fat tissue because we associate certain foods with certain body compositions. Whereas you are not what you eat, you are what you absorb and assimilate. So it actually gets out of the GI tract and into the cell. And that's dependent upon a lot of different things. If you eat a meal and then you go for a 10-minute walk, you will take more of those nutrients out of the bloodstream and deposit them in muscle tissue as opposed to fat tissue. That walk will make you more insulin sensitive. Very basic example, but activity tends to make you more sensitive to carbohydrates, meaning that you can suck them up almost like a sponge into the muscle, and it doesn't float around and then eventually get converted into lipids or fat and then stored as fat. So with the GI tract, what we know is your absorption and utilization of protein is highly, highly dependent upon stomach acid. So we talked about proton pump inhibitors a little bit last time, Ozempic, Pepcid, Zantac, these sort of things that people take, hopefully short-term, but sometimes long-term. I've talked to some folks that have been on them 4 or 5 years. When you start raising the pH in the stomach and you make it less acidic, now you can't really break those links or those bonds between your food. And so with protein, it's harder to kind of split those links in the chain, and then those individual amino acids float around and you absorb them easier. So that's just a quick example so that people can start to really think about, hey, just because I eat this food doesn't necessarily mean that it's going where it should be going. And another classic example you'll see with people is they'll take a B12 supplement and they'll be like, my energy is really low. I got to take some B12 to get my energy up. And that's true. But a lot of times you'll see just because they consume it orally, when you measure B12 in their blood, in their serum, it doesn't go up because you need something called intrinsic factor to actually absorb the B12. The secretion of intrinsic factor is dependent upon a low enough pH or enough acid in the stomach. So there's so much crosstalk that if you're stressed out, you don't make enough acid. If you're low thyroid, you don't make enough acid. If you're taking a proton pump inhibitor, you don't make enough acid. If you're eating really alkaline foods, there's some arguments that maybe this might influence things metabolically, probably less with that one as compared to the first three. So that's where you really want to be thinking about, if I start to throw off this first step in digestion in terms of the acidity in the stomach, then the assimilation or absorption of those nutrients further down the track, so to speak, is going to go down, and the efficiency of eating food, getting it to the cell is that much lower, because that's really what we care about. It's not just the composition. That is important. But if somebody has, we can even talk about something called hyperpermeability, which is just kind of this leaky gut. Everybody's kind of heard that phenomenon. And this kind of started as kind of a pseudo esoteric idea, and medicine kind of brushed it off. And so medicine kind of goes through 3 phases with ideas. The first being, this is completely idiotic and there's no way this is true. The second being, okay, we admit that this is probably a real thing, but it's not clinically relevant. And the third is, hey, look at this cool new thing we just discovered. Well, that thing's been around for a long time. So right now we're kind of in the second stage with leaky gut. And people can experience this with, they eat a meal and they get this sort of weird reaction where they get hives, or they get congestion, or they get joint pain or a headache after they eat. And they're like, well, that's so weird. Food can't do that to me. This is the interaction with that leakiness in the gut. And this is kind of circling back to your question on all the axes and how the gut has a crosstalk with literally everything in the body. So you eat this food, and what should happen is, in the lining of your GI tract, this big long tube, think of it like a PVC pipe. If you were to take that PVC pipe and drill holes all along that PVC pipe, those holes should be present all the time. And that's where, as food gets broken down, you break those links apart. Now you have these nice amino acids that are floating around. You have these nice individual molecules of glucose floating around. Those will then go out through the holes in the pipe. Well, those holes sometimes can actually get smaller, or they can get larger depending upon what's going on. You get stressed out, you get a lot of really big holes. So now those small holes have become really large, and now you're not breaking down protein as well. So now you have this link of protein that's kind of floating around further in the GI tract, and its ability to now move out through those larger holes is improved. But when you have partially digested macronutrients, so you have that link of protein instead of those individual amino acids, When that gets into the bloodstream, now you're seeing this, the immune system is seeing this large thing, which shouldn't be there, shouldn't be this large, should be more broken down. And now all of a sudden it starts to react. And so when you get this immune reaction, this is the skin issues. This is the headaches. This is the flushing. This is the nausea. It's all part of a coordinated immune response that can go anywhere in the body. And so this is where people need to start paying attention to. If I eat this food, I feel this certain way. So two of the big ones that people could just be a little bit more aware of are gluten and dairy. And so there's something in gluten called gliadin. It's part of the protein in wheat, and it makes those little holes a lot bigger. So it increases intestinal permeability. Not always a bad thing, because they should be changing size over time, get smaller and larger. But if you get stressed out, those holes get larger. If you don't sleep as much, those holes get larger. If you add gluten on top of that, those holes get large. And so as they get bigger and bigger to a certain extent, now you get more and more leakiness within the gut. If you start overtraining, training too hard and not recovering, those holes stay big and they leak too much. And so this is where all these factors come in and start talking about gut health. So if somebody only runs a stool panel, a stool sample, basically a comprehensive stool analysis, and they say, well, I don't have this organism and I do have this organism, so I just take a probiotic with this organism and it'll fix it. Not necessarily, because of all the other things we just talked about: stomach acid, how much you train, how leaky is the. So that's where there's so many layers to this web. This is why we're doing a gut health 2.0.
So if somebody is out there and they're like, hey, I'm doing all the right things, and they're being honest, exercise, eating whole foods, sleeping, caloric deficit if they're trying to lose weight, and they're having these symptoms of gut health, what you're saying is it can go into the stomach. But if your gut is not healthy, it's not going to send the amino acids and protein to the muscle.
It's not, I wouldn't say it's a light switch, because I don't want people to think that they're saying, oh, well, I just know I'm not absorbing protein. You probably are, but maybe not to the efficiency.
Yeah, it's going to affect the efficiency of it, right? So all the nutrients you're eating goes into your gut and it sends it out to where it needs to go to either support muscle, improve metabolism, support blood sugar levels, which we know are a big part of feeling good and losing weight. Brain, muscle repair, energy. So you might be doing everything, and if your gut's jacked up, you won't be getting the result from exercise and nutrition that you want.
Yeah, absolutely. Because you can think of this like loops. So really, when I talk to people, I'm always thinking about like what loops are spinning and what are spinning faster than other loops. And so let's talk about young females as an example, because a lot of times that's a big population of individuals that want to change their body composition. And that's awesome. I applaud them for that. We also know in young females, this is a subgroup of individuals that are on, typically a high percentage of them are on some sort of mood altering pharmaceutical, mood stabilizing pharmaceutical, however you want to describe that. The two classes usually are going to be SSRI, selective serotonin reuptake inhibitor, or SNRI, selective norepinephrine reuptake inhibitor. So what does that even mean? That means it keeps serotonin around longer in your brain, and serotonin is kind of that feel-good hormone, or it keeps norepinephrine, that stress hormone, around longer in your brain. And so that'll kind of change your mood, help you to feel a little bit more awake and alert. Now, the thing you really want to be thinking about this is with blood sugar in this population, especially. The number one thing I see in a lot of young females is they skip breakfast and they immediately start their day with caffeine. So now we want to unpack that loop a little bit from a GI perspective. So this is going to be the group of individuals that typically gets hangry and they don't regulate blood sugar as well. And so, okay, so how does all this even relate to weight loss? Because when you alter somebody's mood and you make them a little bit frustrated, a little bit irritable, they don't regulate blood sugar well, they're not eating throughout the day. Now what happens when they get to the end of the day? They're really hungry, they're really famished, they make poor food choices because they're going off of that brain instinct of, hey, we got to get blood sugar up now. So they're going to crave sweets or they're going to crave salt because that's part of the adrenal metabolism. And those are the two things that you'll typically see in this population. And so because of that, then all of a sudden at the end of the day, they might backlog 1,200 or 1,500 calories. And now all of a sudden they've pushed back their caloric deficit. They've eaten back their caloric deficit. So this is where you really want to be thinking about in this population. How does gut health then tie into this? The number one factor that you can control for stress on the adrenal glands is blood sugar regulation. So if you're not eating, your adrenal glands are going to dump out a hormone called cortisol. And its job is when blood sugar starts going down, cortisol comes on scene and brings blood sugar up. Well, the other thing that comes along for the ride with cortisol is all the other stress hormones and that stress kind of waterfall or cascade. So now you start to feel, this is why you get hangry, because you get irritable, but your blood sugar at least is starting to go back up. And so your brain at least has a fuel source. But if you're not controlling your blood sugar well and cortisol is going up, cortisol, you can think of this very simplistically, will come along in the GI tract and start poking holes in the lining of the gut, starts eating away at the lining of the gut. And so this is why it starts to kind of come full circle, because now if cortisol is staying high, you're not eating, you're relying on caffeine, which stimulates the sympathetic or fight or flight nervous system, which drives up cortisol even more. All right, well, now this subpopulation of females is going to have GI issues, along with adrenal issues, along with blood sugar issues. And now you've got 3 different loops that are spinning all simultaneously.
Dude, you just hit home.
So many people.
70% of the young females I work with.
I just had this conversation yesterday.
I'm as you're saying this, I'm like, I need to send this video to like 8 women I know now, right?
Yeah.
Because they get up first thing in the morning. I'm so busy. I'm slamming coffee or an energy drink. It's 2 hours later. Crap, I didn't do anything. I'm just going to chug a protein drink. Right.
Mm-hmm.
Oh my gosh, it's 4 o'clock. I've been busy. I haven't even eaten yet. Oh shoot, I did something to eat at 4 o'clock, like a sandwich. It's 9 o'clock at night. I've been packed up, I can't get it, and I'm smashing a 1,200 calorie meal.
Yeah.
And I'm telling you right now, just saying that should convict 70% of the people we're trying to coach right now.
I think probably more.
Well, what I was going to say is I don't want this conversation to come across as convictional. The number one thing that I would want all young females, any female really, to take away from this conversation is the very first step in reversing this whole process is prioritizing you. So recognizing at the start of your day, you have to get fueled so that then you can go and do whatever you need to do, whether that's your kids or your job or whatever it is, school. So the first thing is that. The second thing to really be thinking about, though, in this population of females is, so now you got this pharmaceutical piece, which, again, we can't necessarily address. We're not going to tell somebody to change meds, but really think through this biochemically. And this is where the link starts to form for a lot of these women. The number one thing that you want to be thinking about is, what is serotonin made from? So in the pathway of serotonin, it starts as something called tryptophan, an amino acid. Tryptophan is found in a lot of protein-rich foods. We know females tend to undereat protein in general. And if you're pushing protein back to the later half of the day, you're not going to make tryptophan in the first half of the day. And you're probably going to underconsume it in the second half of the day, protein in general, because most females are not going to sit and eat 100 grams of protein in one sitting. They're just not. Their physiology generally doesn't digest it as well as males do. Guys, you'll see them eat a 36-ounce steak, and it's like, all right, no big deal. So you got tryptophan, you make 5-hydroxytryptophan or 5-HTP, which people take as a supplement. Then it goes into serotonin. Then it goes into melatonin. So now things get even more interesting, because if you underconsume protein, you might be actually harming your sleep. And we know from the literature that the more protein you eat earlier in the day, the more melatonin you make later in that same day to initiate the onset of sleep. What's the biggest buffer for cortisol that we talked about earlier? Sleep. And melatonin is the biggest inhibitor of cortisol. Now, the other thing to really think about in this equation is when insulin, another hormone that goes up when you eat, when insulin goes up, melatonin goes down. So now if you're this female that you backlogged all your day's calories and now you're eating from 7 o'clock until 10 o'clock at night, well, now your insulin's going to stay high because its job is to take glucose out of the bloodstream and put it into the cell. But now all of a sudden, you haven't made melatonin earlier in the day. Now insulin's really high. So now melatonin's even lower. And so now you don't feel like you want to fall asleep. So now you go to bed a little bit later. And then the next day you start the whole process over again because you're groggy when you wake up, and you have to start with caffeine.
You're smashing caffeine. You're not eating. You're eating later in the day. The 2 things I've done for my sleep and my performance: no caffeine past noon, and not eating 2 hours before I go to bed.
Yep.
But I also know that if you don't eat 2 hours before to go to bed, you have a better rate of growth hormone secretion at night.
Correct. And this is also very dependent upon the population. In young females, many of them are going to have to eat a protein and fat rich snack, because if you have adrenal issues, your blood sugar is going to drop overnight and you will wake up with this rush of cortisol, which is trying to bring your blood sugar back up. But you're going to feel super awake and alert at like 3 and 4 in the morning, and you won't be able to fall back to sleep.
Yes.
Yeah.
So that's where people need to recognize that a lot of these recommendations, they're not, some of them are blanket statements like, hey, don't eat Cheez-Its, go eat an apple. But in terms of that timing of when you're eating before bed, general rule, yes, 2 to 3 hours. But in people that have adrenal and blood sugar issues, especially young females that get hangry, you might want a protein and fat rich snack. Who knows? Cheese stick, half a protein shake, whatever it is, something like that. Experiment with that. Some beef jerky, I don't know. And just see, if you notice that you're sleeping more soundly throughout the night, there's probably some blood sugar and some adrenal pieces there that you want to unpack a little bit.
So it really just connected all of our videos together, right?
Mm-hmm.
We all know everything works together.
Mm-hmm.
Gut health and hormones, right? Gut health and nutrient partitioning, which is getting nutrients where it needs to go in the body so it can function correctly. Our first video was just covering all three. Our second one was covering hormones. But in the 2 videos of gut health, you've just connected gut health to hormones. And it's all working together, all for our body to work efficiently, to build muscle, to burn fat, to be at an optimal weight, to perform better.
Mm-hmm. So wait, real quick, since we're on females, the other thing to circle back on, since we're talking about gut health and hormones, postmenopausal. So we talked about young female. Remember, a lot of postmenopausal females, what's the number one thing that they typically get taken out is their gallbladder. With your gallbladder,
That's true.
A lot of postmenopausal women, they lose gallbladders really easily. And so the number one thing to keep in mind is your gallbladder squirts out bile when you eat a fatty meal. And in that bile, that's how you actually get rid of hormones. And so if you have a female that you take out a gallbladder on, and just as a point of reference for people, the studies have shown if you yo-yo diet more than 20 pounds in a year, or multiple years, you have a 70% increase of having your gallbladder removed because of all the other biochemical changes that take place. Now you can't remove hormones and get rid of them as easily. Now you might be more high estrogen females, or now you might see an imbalance in estrogen and progesterone, all these other things. So even in postmenopausal women, gut health still plays a huge, huge role, especially if you don't have a gallbladder with hormones.
I just started a client that's 52 years old, postmenopausal, with gallbladder removed.
Right. And do not ever, anybody watching this video, if you do not have a gallbladder, do not start keto without first doing some digging on all your health and everything that's going on, because you will hate life, because you have no storage reserve for bile. And if you're going to eat a super fatty meal, you're not going to feel very good.
We have a minute left. Are we doing a gut health 3.0 now?
I think we have to, because we still haven't talked about training intensity. I want to dive more into the gallbladder.
I just think it's too important.
We might have 5 parts of this.
Yeah, I just think it's too important. And I do like the fact that we're hitting this with people with 30-minute videos at a time, as opposed to like this 3-hour-long podcast.
Yeah.
I'm going to work on breaking this down into little mini minute clips. I think the gallbladder part was important. The in the morning is important. The eating late at night is important. So people understand. All right, y'all. We're going to do a 3.0. I'll get this out and we'll go from there. Is that cool?
Perfect.
Yep.
All right.